On a quiet Sunday morning in a small Texas town, faith turned to fear within seconds. As worshipers bowed their heads in prayer, a gunman's rage shattered the peace of a community. What drove a former airman to bring such horror to a house of God? And why was he never stopped? It was a quiet Sunday morning in Sutherland Springs, a small rural town in southern Texas, where everyone seemed to know everyone else. The town had fewer than 700 residents, surrounded by open fields, dusty roads, and a sense of peace that only small communities can hold on to. On November 5, 2017, the First Baptist Church stood as it had for decades, its white exterior glowing under the late morning sun. Families gathered for their usual worship service. Children fidgeted beside their parents, and the pastor's words carried softly through the wooden pews. Nothing about that morning suggested that within minutes, this calm would turn into a scene of unimaginable horror. 26-year-old Devin Patrick Kelly was on his way to the church, driving a gray Ford Expedition down the narrow road that led into town. He had grown up in New Braunfels, about 35 miles away, and his life had been a pattern of failure, anger, and violence. A former U.S. Air Force airman, Kelly had served at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. But his service had ended in disgrace. He was court-martialed in 2012 for assaulting his wife and his stepson. Reports later revealed that he had fractured the child's skull and beaten his wife during his time in the military. For that, he spent a year in confinement and was given a bad conduct discharge. After his release, Kelly drifted through life. He worked odd jobs, struggled with relationships, and became known for his temper. His marriage fell apart, and he remarried a young woman named Danielle Shields, the daughter of Michelle and Joe Shields, who were active members of the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs. But even this new chapter brought no peace. Kelly's behavior became controlling and abusive again. Arguments between him and Danielle were frequent, often turning violent. When Danielle moved out and sought safety with her parents, Kelly's anger boiled over into hatred. That morning, as the church prepared for prayer, Kelly's mind was filled with rage. He had texted his mother-in-law, Michelle Shields, a series of threatening messages just days earlier. He blamed her for interfering in his marriage and taking Danielle's side. The First Baptist Church was where Michelle often attended, and Kelly knew exactly what time the Sunday service would be underway. His plan was deliberate and fueled by vengeance. At around 11:20 a.m., witnesses outside heard the sound of a vehicle stopping near the church. Kelly stepped out wearing all black tactical gear, a bulletproof vest, and a black mask with a skull design. In his hands was a Ruger AR-556 rifle, one of several firearms he had legally purchased, despite his criminal record. The Air Force had failed to upload his domestic violence conviction into the national background check system, allowing him to pass gun purchase screenings without issue. It was a bureaucratic mistake that would cost dozens of lives. Kelly approached the small white church and began firing from outside, shattering windows and sending bullets through the wooden walls. People inside screamed and ducked for cover as gunfire echoed through the sanctuary. Witnesses later described how the sound was deafening, the air thick with dust, smoke, and the smell of gunpowder. He entered through the front door and methodically moved through the pews, shooting men, women, and children. No one was spared. Among those inside was 14-year-old Annabelle Pomeroy, the daughter of the church's pastor, Frank Pomeroy, who was out of town that day. Annabelle was sitting with friends when the shooting began. Others included longtime residents, grandparents, young couples, and entire families who had come for worship. Within minutes, the small church was filled with chaos and bloodshed. The youngest victim was just 18 months old. The oldest was 77. Outside, neighbors began to hear the commotion. One of them was Stephen Williford, a 55-year-old plumber and former National Rifle Association instructor who lived across the street. Williford had been relaxing at home when his daughter ran in, yelling that she heard gunshots coming from the church. He grabbed his AR-15 rifle from his safe, loaded a magazine, and ran out the door barefoot. As he approached the scene, he saw Kelly stepping out of the church, dressed for combat and carrying his rifle. Williford took cover behind a truck and fired. One of his bullets struck Kelly in the leg, another in the torso. Kelly turned toward Williford, fired several shots in return, and then ran to his vehicle. Williford kept his aim steady and fired again as the gunman got into his SUV and sped away. At that moment, another local man, 27-year-old Johnny Langendorf, happened to drive by in his pickup truck. Williford shouted to him that the gunman was escaping, and without hesitation, Langendorf told him to get in. The two men took off after Kelly, calling 911 as they raced through the rural roads at nearly 95 miles per hour. Back at the church, the silence that followed was haunting. Survivors stumbled out, bleeding, crying, and in shock. Those who could move tried to help the injured. The floor was covered in shell casings and debris. For a town that had never seen violence, the sight was unreal. A place of worship turned into a battlefield. As Williford and Langendorf pursued Kelly, dispatchers relayed information to nearby law enforcement. After about 10 minutes, Kelly lost control of his SUV and veered off the road into a field. When police arrived, they found him dead in the driver's seat with a gunshot wound to the head. Later investigations confirmed that he had shot himself after being wounded by Williford's return fire. Back in Sutherland Springs, emergency vehicles filled the narrow road outside the church. Helicopters landed in nearby fields to airlift survivors to hospitals in San Antonio. Families gathered behind police tape, calling out names, praying for news, some collapsing when they learned the worst. Pastor Frank Pomeroy returned home to find that his daughter Annabelle was among the victims. It was a loss that broke him, as it broke the entire town. Within hours, national news agencies descended on the small community. Reporters, photographers, and law enforcement from across Texas filled the area. Governor Greg Abbott called it one of the deadliest mass shootings in Texas history. President Donald Trump, traveling overseas at the time, called the event an act of evil. Yet, behind the headlines and statements, the people of Sutherland Springs were left with unbearable grief. In the following days, investigators pieced together Kelly's path of violence, his abusive past, his court-martial, his threats toward his in-laws, and the system failures that had allowed him to buy his weapons. What began as a domestic dispute had turned into one of the most horrific acts of violence ever committed inside a church in the United States. But even as law enforcement worked through the details, the town struggled to process the trauma. Small crosses appeared outside the church, each with the name of a victim written in black marker. People from nearby towns drove in to offer help, bring food, and hold candlelight vigils. The white church building, once a symbol of faith and safety, had become a site of unimaginable sorrow. This was only the beginning of a story that would reveal not just the cruelty of one man's rage, but also the deep failures that allowed it to happen, and the extraordinary courage of those who refused to let evil have the last word. In the days following the massacre, the small town of Sutherland Springs became the focus of national grief and attention. What had once been a quiet and close-knit community now found itself surrounded by law enforcement vehicles, news cameras, and mourners from across the country. The white wooden walls of the First Baptist Church, once filled with the sounds of hymns and prayers, were now surrounded by crime scene tape. Bullet holes pierced its siding, shattered windows lay scattered, and the faint smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. Inside, investigators carefully documented every piece of evidence. The floor was littered with shell casings. 450 rounds in total had been fired during those terrifying minutes. Forensic teams from the FBI, ATF, and Texas Rangers worked day and night, mapping bullet trajectories, collecting fingerprints, and photographing the devastating scene. Each pew told a silent story of panic and loss. They found Bibles opened on laps, purses dropped mid-prayer, and hymn books marked at Faith of Our Fathers. It was not just a crime scene, it was a place of worship turned into a graveyard. The list of victims was soon released, and with it, the full weight of the tragedy came into focus. Among the dead were 8 members of the Holcomb family, 3 generations lost in a matter of seconds. Pregnant mother Crystal Holcomb, her unborn child, her children Emily, Megan, and Greg, and other family members were all killed as they sat together. 60-year-old Brian Holcomb, a church elder who was filling in as the guest preacher that day, was among the first to be shot as he stood behind the pulpit. His wife, Carla, also perished beside him. The victims' ages range from a toddler barely learning to walk to elderly grandparents who had attended the church for decades. Entire families were wiped out, and the loss left deep holes in the heart of the town. For residents, it wasn't just names on a list, it was neighbors, friends, and loved ones. The following week, funerals were held one after another. Coffins lined up in rows became a sight no one would ever forget. The sound of bagpipes playing Amazing Grace carried through the fields as people wept openly. Authorities began digging into Devin Patrick Kelly's background. What emerged was a disturbing picture of a man shaped by anger, control, and unchecked violence. Records revealed that his history of abuse dated back years. In 2012, while serving in the Air Force, Kelly had beaten his first wife and cracked his stepson's skull. The Air Force court-martialed him, reduced his rank, and sentenced him to a year in military prison. Yet, after his release, the system failed to flag his record in the National Background Check Database, which would have prevented him from purchasing firearms. This failure allowed him to buy multiple weapons, including the Ruger AR-556 rifle used in the massacre. Investigators also learned that Kelly had escaped from a mental health facility in New Mexico during his time in the Air Force. He was deemed dangerous to himself and others, yet he faced no long-term restrictions after his discharge. His online presence revealed a fascination with guns and violence. He had posted pictures of his weapons on social media, often posing with rifles and wearing black tactical gear. There were also signs of growing resentment toward religion and those he believed had wronged him. As law enforcement pieced together his final days, a timeline began to form. On the morning of November 5th, Kelly had argued with his wife, Danielle. She was staying with her parents, Joe and Michelle Shields, who were active members of the First Baptist Church. Michelle had received threatening text messages from him the night before. Investigators later found out that Kelly had been planning to confront her at the church. When he arrived and saw her car missing, he decided to attack anyway, killing everyone in sight. Ballistics reports showed that Kelly had used a semi-automatic rifle capable of firing 30 rounds without pause. He carried multiple magazines, reloading as he moved through the sanctuary. Witnesses who survived recalled how he walked calmly, stepping between pews, targeting anyone who moved. One survivor said there was no hesitation in him. He wanted to kill every single person in there. When police examined his vehicle after the crash, they found more weapons, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, and his cell phone. Inside the phone were text exchanges filled with anger and threats directed at his wife and mother-in-law. He had also looked up directions to the church on Google Maps, confirming the attack was premeditated. As the investigation deepened, questions arose about how many warning signs had been ignored. Reports surfaced that local law enforcement in New Braunfels had received calls about Kelly's violent behavior before. Former classmates and neighbors described him as strange, angry, and obsessed with control. One former friend told investigators that Kelly had often spoken of hurting people who disrespected him. For the people of Sutherland Springs, though, understanding why was almost impossible. No explanation could justify the loss. The community began to hold vigils in nearby towns, gathering at sunset to light candles and pray for the victims. People from across the nation sent letters, flowers, and donations. Churches in other states held moments of silence. Yet, for survivors, the pain was too personal. Those who had lived through the attack described recurring nightmares and overwhelming guilt. Some lost entire families in one morning. The First Baptist Church itself was eventually transformed into a memorial. The walls were repainted white, and 26 chairs were placed inside, each representing a life lost. On every chair, a rose was laid with a name. It became a place for mourning and remembrance, and also a stark reminder of what unchecked violence could do. Governor Greg Abbott visited the site multiple times, calling it an act of pure evil. He also met with families of the victims and survivors, promising support and answers. President Trump, speaking from Japan during his Asia trip, said that the tragedy was the result of a very deranged individual with a lot of problems. But for the families in Sutherland Springs, these statements, while comforting, couldn't bring back what was lost. Behind the scenes, federal and state investigators worked to piece together every element of Kelly's life. They contacted the Air Force, demanding answers about the administrative mistake that had allowed him to slip through the background check system. The Air Force later admitted its failure publicly and promised to correct similar errors to prevent future tragedies. The more details that surfaced, the clearer the pattern became: a troubled man, a history of abuse, a system that failed to stop him, and a moment of rage that turned into mass murder. But in this darkness, acts of bravery still shone. Stephen Williford, the man who had confronted Kelly with his rifle, was hailed as a hero. In interviews, he remained humble, saying, "I didn't want to be a hero. I just wanted to stop him before he killed anyone else." His quick response and courage likely prevented Kelly from attacking another nearby church or escaping to cause more bloodshed. As the investigation continued, Sutherland Springs faced the painful task of healing. The community built a new church on donated land nearby, symbolizing resilience and faith. Survivors gathered weekly to support each other, rebuilding a sense of hope amid tragedy. But justice for the victims could only come through understanding how such a man was allowed to arm himself in the first place, and why no one had stopped him before he reached that church. Those questions would lead investigators to uncover the final pieces of Devin Patrick Kelly's story, and the failures that made one of the deadliest church shootings in American history possible. As the investigation reached its final stage, the story of the Sutherland Springs church shooting unfolded into a devastating portrait of anger, failure, and broken systems. In the weeks after the massacre, the focus turned to how a man with a violent past could legally obtain the weapons used to carry out such a horrific act. The truth revealed a series of missed warnings and administrative mistakes that would haunt multiple institutions. Devin Patrick Kelly's military history became the center of the inquiry. While serving in the U.S. Air Force, Kelly had been court-martialed for assaulting his first wife and her young son in 2012. He fractured the child's skull and repeatedly beat his wife, leading to a 1-year prison sentence and a bad conduct discharge. According to Air Force policy, his conviction should have been reported to the FBI's National Instant Criminal Background Check System, a database that would have flagged him as ineligible to purchase firearms. But it was never submitted. This clerical failure, as later admitted by Air Force officials, allowed Kelly to buy at least 4 guns after his release. One of those weapons, a Ruger AR-556 rifle, became the tool of destruction inside the First Baptist Church. Law enforcement agencies, along with the FBI and ATF, spent months reconstructing the shooter's path. They traced every weapon purchase, examined every email, and reviewed every recorded incident from his life. They discovered that Kelly had bought the rifle at a San Antonio sporting goods store, passing the background check without issue. He also owned several handguns and rifles purchased in different states. Each sale was technically legal, proof that the system had failed at its most crucial point. Investigators found that Kelly had shown signs of instability long before the shooting. He had been cited for animal cruelty in Colorado, accused of beating a dog. He was also known for his obsession with weapons and control. He often posted photos online posing with guns, dressed in black tactical gear, projecting an image of power. Friends and acquaintances later described him as cold, isolated, and dangerously angry. Several said they had cut off contact with him because of his violent outbursts. In the days before the shooting, Kelly's relationship with his second wife, Danielle, had completely collapsed. Danielle had moved out with their young child and taken refuge with her parents, Joe and Michelle Shields, the same in-laws Kelly blamed for ruining his marriage. Michelle attended the First Baptist Church regularly, and Kelly knew her routine. On November 4th, the day before the attack, he texted her threatening messages, accusing her of betrayal. Investigators later retrieved those texts, which confirmed that his motive was deeply personal, rooted in anger and revenge toward his family. On the morning of November 5, 2017, Kelly loaded his rifle and magazines, dressed in all-black tactical gear, and set out for the small church that had become the center of his rage. When he discovered that Michelle was not inside that day, his anger turned indiscriminate. He decided that if he could not hurt her directly, he would destroy everything connected to her: her church, her friends, her peace. The aftermath left the community forever changed. 26 lives were lost, including an unborn child, and 22 others were injured. The town's entire population had been touched by the tragedy in some way. Families who had worshiped together for generations were gone in minutes. It was not only an act of violence, it was an attempt to erase an entire circle of faith and community. As federal and state authorities released their findings, public outrage grew over the failures that had allowed Kelly to arm himself. The U.S. Air Force took full responsibility, admitting that it had neglected to report his conviction. This failure prompted the Department of Defense to review tens of thousands of similar cases to ensure that all disqualifying records were properly entered into the FBI system. The tragedy became a turning point in discussions about gun control, domestic violence reporting, and background check reform. While the shooter had died at the scene from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, his death brought little comfort. There would be no trial, no confession, no sentence, only questions that would never be answered. Yet, through investigation and testimony, a clear picture of his motives and actions emerged. He had planned the attack alone. There were no accomplices, no larger conspiracy, just one man's hatred, intensified by rage and enabled by institutional negligence. Survivors continued to share their stories, giving haunting accounts of the moments inside the church. One woman described pretending to be dead as bullets whizzed over her head. Another man recalled holding his dying wife's hand until the gunfire stopped. Parents buried children, husbands buried wives, and entire families were laid to rest side by side. The town of Sutherland Springs, with its small population and tight community bonds, found itself united in grief. But amid that sorrow came resilience. People from across the United States sent letters, donations, and messages of support. Volunteers arrived to help rebuild the church, while counselors and clergy offered comfort to the survivors. The First Baptist Church reopened months later, not as a place of horror, but as a symbol of strength. The building was remodeled into a memorial, with 26 white chairs representing each victim. On each chair sat a single red rose, a nameplate, and a cross. In time, a new church was constructed nearby, larger, brighter, and filled with reminders of hope. Pastor Frank Pomeroy, who had lost his 14-year-old daughter Annabelle in the attack, returned to lead the congregation. His voice often broke during sermons, but his message remained steady. Faith would not be destroyed by violence. "We will never forget what was taken from us," he said at the dedication service, "but we will not let evil win." The official investigation concluded months later. The FBI, the Texas Rangers, and local law enforcement released a joint report confirming that the shooter had acted alone and that the motive was domestic in nature, linked to long-standing anger and abuse. The report also highlighted the system failures that made the tragedy possible, calling for stronger enforcement of firearm restrictions for convicted domestic abusers. Families of the victims later filed lawsuits against the U.S. Air Force for negligence in failing to report Kelly's criminal record. In 2021, a federal judge ruled that the Air Force was 60% responsible for the attack due to its reporting failure. In 2023, the government agreed to pay more than $230 million in damages to the victims' families, an acknowledgement that the system's mistakes had directly contributed to their loss. Though no court could truly deliver justice for the lives taken, the ruling provided some closure. It became one of the largest legal settlements ever reached in connection with a mass shooting. Survivors spoke publicly about their continued pain, but also about their determination to honor those who were gone. The case of the Sutherland Springs church shooting remains one of the deadliest mass shootings in a place of worship in U.S. history. It serves as both a lesson and a warning, a reminder that unchecked anger, domestic abuse, and system failures can lead to unimaginable destruction. It also stands as a testament to courage, the bravery of Stephen Williford, who risked his life to confront the gunman, and the strength of a community that chose forgiveness over hatred. In the years that followed, the story of Sutherland Springs became more than a record of tragedy. It became a story of faith's endurance. The white church still stands, its walls now silent but filled with memory. Each November, candles are lit, bells are rung 26 times, and the town gathers to remember, not the man who brought death to their doorstep, but the lives that defined their community. The tragedy of that Sunday morning will never fade from memory, but neither will the spirit of the people who survived it rebuilt and kept their faith alive in the heart of Texas. In a small Texas town where life once moved quietly, one teenage boy's hidden rage erupted into a national nightmare. What drove Salvador Ramos to turn his anger on innocent children? This is the haunting story of Uvalde, a day of horror, silence, and unforgivable failure. In the quiet town of Uvalde, Texas, life moved at a slow, familiar pace. It was a kind of place where families knew one another, where neighbors exchanged waves, and where the elementary school stood at the heart of the community. But on May 24, 2022, that calm was shattered forever when 18-year-old Salvador Ramos turned Robb Elementary School into a scene of unimaginable horror. The tragedy that followed would not only claim innocent lives, but also expose deep flaws in law enforcement response and raise painful questions about the growing crisis of youth violence in America. Salvador Ramos was an ordinary name in an ordinary town, but his life had been far from stable. He was a thin, quiet teenager who often kept to himself. Classmates described him as someone who drifted between silence and sudden bursts of anger. Ramos had dropped out of Uvalde High School months before the shooting. He worked a part-time job at a local Wendy's, rarely talking to coworkers, keeping his head down, and avoiding small talk. He was often bullied for his clothes, his stutter, and his withdrawn nature. Over time, this rejection began to change him. His online presence started reflecting a darker side, posts about weapons, aggression, and violent fantasies. He lived with his 66-year-old grandmother, Celia Gonzalez, in a small, aging house on Diaz Street. His relationship with his mother was strained. They often argued, and he had moved out of her home to live with his grandmother, who cared for him despite his growing unpredictability. Celia worried about her grandson. He had become reclusive, spending most of his time in his room gaming, chatting with strangers online, and showing off weapons on social media. Friends, if they could be called that, noticed he was changing. He started boasting about guns and hinted that something big was coming. Few took him seriously. In the weeks before the attack, Ramos legally purchased 2 AR-15 style rifles and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Texas law allowed him to do so as soon as he turned 18. His online searches included previous mass shootings and tactical gear. He even messaged an online acquaintance days before, saying he planned to do something major. The warning went unnoticed. Behind the closed doors of his small room, Salvador Ramos prepared for what would become one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. The morning of May 24th started like any other in Uvalde. The sun rose over the quiet streets, and parents dropped off their children at Robb Elementary School. The students were in their final days of the school year, excited for summer vacation. In one corner classroom, teachers Eva Morales, 44, and Irma Garcia, 48, were guiding their fourth graders through lessons. They had worked together for years, teaching side by side, known for their dedication and motherly care. None of them could have imagined what the next few hours would bring. At his grandmother's house, Salvador Ramos woke up tense and silent. He argued with Celia about his phone bill. Moments later, in a sudden act of violence, he shot her in the face. She fell bleeding, but somehow managed to call for help. Ramos fled in her pickup truck, carrying his rifles and ammunition. It was 11 a.m. He sped down Highway 83 toward Robb Elementary, his mind fixed on his plan. Near the school, he lost control and crashed the truck into a ditch. Witnesses nearby saw him climb out with a gun in hand. They shouted warnings and called 911 as he began firing at them. Within minutes, he approached the school. A teacher saw him armed and ran inside to call lockdown, but a side door that should have been locked was left open. Ramos entered without resistance. Surveillance footage later showed him walking down the empty hallway, holding his rifle. He fired randomly at classroom doors before finding an unlocked one, room 111, connected to room 112. Inside, 19 children and 2 teachers were about to face their worst nightmare. At around 11:33 a.m., the first burst of gunfire rang through the school. Dozens of shots were fired in seconds. Panic voices filled 911 lines. Children in other classrooms hid under desks and whispered to one another not to make a sound. The 2 teachers, Eva and Irma, tried to protect their students, gathering them close and shielding them with their own bodies. But the bullets came fast. Ramos continued firing for several minutes, killing nearly everyone in the 2 adjoining rooms. Outside, chaos erupted. Parents began hearing the news through text messages and rushed toward the school, their hearts pounding, desperate to see their children. Police units arrived quickly, within minutes of the crash. Local officers, school district police, and later, state troopers surrounded the building. Gunshots still echoed inside, but the officers held back, unsure of the situation. They believed the shooter had barricaded himself and that there were no survivors left in the classroom. This misjudgment would later prove fatal. Inside, terrified children whispered into their phones, calling 911 and begging for help. "Please send the police now," one little girl said softly. As the minutes turned to half an hour, more officers arrived, eventually numbering more than 370 personnel from various departments. Yet confusion reigned. Communication between agencies was poor, and no one took command. Parents outside screamed at officers to go in. Some had to be restrained as they tried to break through police lines. Every minute felt like an eternity. Meanwhile, inside rooms 111 and 112, the silence between bursts of gunfire was unbearable. A few children played dead to survive. Some whispered prayers. Blood covered the classroom floors. The horror unfolding in those rooms was beyond anything the small town of Uvalde could imagine. At 12:03 p.m., another 911 call came from inside the classroom. There were still children alive. But police remained stationed in the hallway. They continued to wait for a tactical unit with shields and breaching tools. Outside, ambulances stood ready, unaware that time was running out. The delay, later described as the most critical failure, stretched on for nearly an hour. By the time the Border Patrol Tactical Team BORTAC arrived and prepared to breach the room, the situation had already become one of the deadliest school shootings in American history. The decision to move in was finally made at 12:50 p.m., nearly 80 minutes after the first shots were fired. The gunman's rampage had already left 21 people dead and others critically wounded. What happened next would mark the end of the standoff, but it could never undo the irreversible damage done to the heart of a small Texas town. The scene inside Robb Elementary School on May 24, 2022, was beyond imagination. The walls that had once displayed colorful drawings and cheerful class projects were now covered in bullet holes and blood. The faint sound of children's cries echoed through the hallways, but police officers stationed outside the classrooms hesitated. Dozens of them stood only a few feet from the shooter, hearing shots and screams, yet unsure of how to act. They had the weapons, the shields, and the training, but they lacked one crucial thing: decisive leadership. This failure would later become one of the most heavily criticized moments in American law enforcement history. Outside the school, chaos had taken over. Dozens of parents gathered behind the yellow tape, their faces pale with fear. Many screamed at the officers to do something, pleading to let them in if the police wouldn't move. Mothers cried out their children's names, hoping for an answer. Fathers tried to run past officers, but were restrained or handcuffed. The air was filled with panic, sirens, and the sound of distant gunfire still coming from inside the building. Nobody could believe that minutes had turned into an hour, while children were still trapped with a killer. Inside the hallway, At least 19 officers from the Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District Police, along with city police, county deputies, and Texas state troopers, gathered near rooms 111 and 112. They could hear occasional gunfire, but commanders on the scene insisted it was no longer an active shooter situation. They believed Salvador Ramos was barricaded and that the victims were already dead. This assumption was tragically wrong. At 12:10 p.m., a 911 dispatcher relayed another call from a child inside the classroom. The young girl whispered that multiple students were still alive. Officers in the hallway heard this, but still didn't act. Some wanted to move in, but others waited for a key to unlock the classroom door. That key, they later learned, was unnecessary. The door wasn't even locked. Investigations would later reveal that this confusion and lack of communication cost precious lives that could have been saved. By now, the school was surrounded by over 370 law enforcement personnel from local, state, and federal agencies, including the Border Patrol Tactical Unit (BORTAC). Outside, Uvalde County Sheriff's deputies worked to secure the perimeter, while medics stood by with stretchers and medical kits, waiting for the go-ahead to treat victims. But no one could reach the wounded children because the police inside were still waiting for orders. At 12:30 p.m., frustration began to build among the officers. One officer could be heard saying, "If there's kids in there, we need to go in." Still, their commander told them to hold. Minutes passed, and the sound of silence grew heavier. For those trapped inside, every second was unbearable. Some children pretended to be dead to survive. Others whispered prayers, trying to comfort each other. A teacher, barely alive, tried to shield her students until her final breath. Finally, at 12:46 p.m., after nearly 75 minutes of waiting, the Border Patrol tactical team decided they could no longer delay. Using a master key provided by a janitor, they prepared to breach the classroom. At 12:50 p.m., they opened fire, killing Salvador Ramos within seconds. The young gunman fell to the floor, ending the massacre. The standoff was over, but the horror was just beginning to unfold. When officers entered the classroom, the sight was devastating. 19 children and 2 teachers lay motionless. Some had died instantly. Others had clung to life, but didn't survive the long wait for help. Blood covered the floors. Small backpacks and school supplies were scattered everywhere. Pencils, notebooks, and colorful drawings stained red. The rescuers struggled to hold back tears as they carried the survivors out. Outside, ambulances rushed to the scene. Paramedics performed CPR on injured children in the schoolyard. Helicopters landed nearby to airlift the wounded to hospitals. The parents who had waited for hours watched in anguish as stretchers rolled out, some carrying their children, others covered in white sheets. The reality hit the town of Uvalde with a force that would scar it forever. News of the shooting spread across the country within minutes. National networks broke their regular programming to report from the scene. The death toll, 19 children and 2 teachers, sent shockwaves through America and the world. President Joe Biden addressed the nation that evening, his voice filled with grief and frustration, once again urging stronger gun control laws. Vigils were held in cities across the country, with candles lit for the young lives lost in a place that was supposed to be safe. In Uvalde, the days that followed were filled with mourning and disbelief. The 2 teachers, Eva Morales and Irma Garcia, were hailed as heroes who died protecting their students. Their bravery became a symbol of love and sacrifice. But the pain deepened when, just 2 days later, Joe Garcia, Irma's husband, suffered a fatal heart attack while delivering flowers to a memorial site. The couple left behind 4 children, making their story one of unbearable heartbreak. The community came together for funerals that stretched over weeks. Small coffins were carried through the streets as hundreds of residents lined up in silence. Photographs of smiling children, faces full of innocence, were displayed on posters and memorial walls. Volunteers from across Texas arrived to support families, bringing food, flowers, and words of comfort. Yet, behind the tears, there was growing anger. Questions began to rise about the police response. Why did it take so long to confront the shooter? Why did officers wait in the hallway while children begged for help? The Uvalde community demanded answers. Journalists and investigators began digging into the timeline, uncovering troubling facts. The first officers had arrived just minutes after the shooting began, yet the gunman had been allowed to continue killing for over an hour. Public outrage intensified when body camera footage was released. It showed heavily armed officers standing in the hallway, equipped with shields and rifles, but refusing to move forward. Parents who had been handcuffed for trying to save their children now watched the footage in disbelief. The police chief of the school district, Pete Arredondo, became the central figure of criticism. He had been the on-scene commander and had decided to treat the situation as a barricade rather than an active shooting. His decision not to order an immediate assault was called catastrophic failure. As investigations continued, lawmakers and officials began facing the pressure of accountability. The Texas Department of Public Safety conducted a full review, while the U.S. Department of Justice launched its own investigation. The focus was not only on the shooter, but on the long list of mistakes that followed him into that classroom. In the months that followed the Uvalde school shooting, grief turned into outrage. The small Texas town, once known for its quiet charm, became the center of national attention. Every day, new details emerged about the slow and confused police response. Families of the victims demanded accountability, not just from a shooter, who was dead, but from those who had failed to act when their children needed them most. Memorials filled with candles, photographs, and handwritten notes stood outside Robb Elementary. But behind every flickering light was a family demanding the truth. The investigation revealed a devastating timeline. From the moment Salvador Ramos entered the school at 11:33 a.m. to the time he was killed at 12:50 p.m., 376 law enforcement officers had gathered on the scene. They included local police, sheriff's deputies, Texas Rangers, and even federal agents. Yet, for 77 long minutes, none of them took decisive action. The classroom door, which officers believed was locked, had never been secured. Officers waited for shields, keys, and orders that never came, while terrified children bled and died only a few feet away. The Texas Department of Public Safety's director, Steve McCraw, later called it an abject failure. In hearings before the Texas Senate, he condemned the command decisions made that day, saying the officers had enough firepower and training to stop the shooter within 3 minutes of arriving. The finger of blame pointed most directly at Pete Arredondo, the Uvalde School District Police Chief. He had taken command on the scene, but failed to treat the incident as an active shooter situation. Instead, he believed the gunman was barricaded, and that the children were already beyond help. This single decision, investigators concluded, led to a delay that cost innocent lives. The Uvalde community's anger deepened as they watched officials shift blame. Parents like Kimberly Rubio and Felix Rubio, who lost their daughter Lexi, became vocal advocates for justice. They testified before Congress, begging lawmakers to take action on gun reform and school safety. "We trusted the police to protect our children," Kimberly said, her voice breaking. But they stood there and did nothing. Across the country, their words echoed through the halls of power, reigniting debates about assault weapons, background checks, and mental health support. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice launched an independent review to examine every step of the law enforcement response. The report, released months later, confirmed what the families already knew. Communication had broken down, leadership had failed, and officers on scene had prioritized their own safety over saving children. It was one of the most damning analyses of a police operation in modern American history. The story of the shooter himself, Salvador Ramos, became a haunting symbol of how isolation and violence can fester unnoticed. Born and raised in Uvalde, he had grown up shy and withdrawn. His classmates described him as bullied and mocked. Over time, his anger turned inward, and the internet became his escape. Investigators found that Ramos had spent years engaging with online communities that glorified violence. He showed off his weapons to strangers, talking about his hatred and fantasies of revenge. Despite several warning signs, no one intervened. There was no confession, no cry for help, Only silence until the morning he pulled the trigger. At the end of 2022, the families of Uvalde continued to fight for justice. There was no trial or sentencing. Salvador Ramos had been killed at the scene. But the accountability shifted toward those who had failed to act. Pete Arredondo was fired from his position, and several officers faced disciplinary actions or resignations. Lawsuits were filed against the city, the school district, and state agencies, alleging negligence and wrongful death. The fight for reform spread beyond Uvalde, across Texas and the entire nation. In the aftermath, Robb Elementary School was permanently closed. Plans were made to build a new school, one that would stand as both a memorial and a promise that such a tragedy would never happen again. Yet for the families, no new building could erase the loss. Birthdays passed in silence. Empty chairs remained at dinner tables. The sound of laughter that once filled classrooms was replaced with quiet remembrance. The theme that emerged from Uvalde was not only about one act of senseless violence, but about the system that allowed it to unfold unchecked. It was a story of failure and heartbreak, but also of resilience and the demand for change. From the ashes of tragedy, parents turned into advocates, children into symbols of innocence lost, and a town into a voice for reform. The Uvalde school shooting exposed the deadly cost of hesitation and the human toll of America's gun violence crisis. It revealed how anger and loneliness can grow into something catastrophic when left unseen. Most of all, it reminded the world that heroism is not found in weapons or uniforms, but in the hearts of those who choose to protect others, like Eva Mireles and Irma Garcia, who gave their lives for their students. The story of Uvalde ends not with justice served, but with a nation forced to confront its reflection. In the eyes of grieving parents and a community still healing, the question remains, how many more children must die before the lessons of Uvalde are truly learned? A quiet evening of prayer turned into a night of unimaginable horror inside Charleston's historic Emmanuel AME Church. What drove a young man to sit among worshipers before opening fire? In this haunting story of hate, faith, and forgiveness, America confronts one of its darkest chapters and its deepest wounds. Charleston, South Carolina, a city known for its charm, cobblestone streets, and deep historical roots. Yet beneath its beauty lies a long and painful history of slavery and racial division. In June 2015, this peaceful coastal city became the center of one of the most shocking hate crimes in modern American history. The crime would unfold inside Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, a sacred place known simply as Mother Emanuel, the oldest black church in the South. For generations, it had stood as a symbol of faith, resilience, and hope for the African American community. On the night of June 17, 2015, that hope was shattered by a young man driven by hatred. Dylan Stormroof was just 21 years old. Born in Columbia, South Carolina, he had grown up in a broken household, drifting between his divorced parents and struggling to find direction in life. He was quiet, withdrawn, and never held a steady job. Those who knew him described him as strange, detached, and often isolated. Yet behind his soft-spoken appearance, something darker was growing. By his late teens, Roof had become obsessed with racist ideology. Spending long hours on extremist websites, he absorbed propaganda that claimed white people were under threat for minorities. Slowly, he came to believe that violence was the only answer. In early 2015, Roof began forming a plan, one that would turn his twisted thoughts into deadly action. He started visiting Confederate heritage sites, taking photos with flags and symbols of white supremacy. In his mind, he was preparing for something larger, a self-declared mission to ignite what he called a race war. His logic was cold and delusional. If he attacked a prominent black church, he believed it would spark massive racial violence across the country. He didn't want to target criminals or gangs. He wanted to attack innocent, faithful people, hoping that their deaths would spread fear and division. Meanwhile, the community at Emmanuel AME Church carried on with its daily rhythm of faith and service. On Wednesday, June 17th, the church doors opened, as they did every week, for Bible study. The pastor, Reverend Clementa Pinckney, was leading the session that evening. At 41 years old, he wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was also a respected South Carolina state senator, known for his calm presence and compassion. Around him sat a small group of 9 regular members and a few visitors. These were ordinary people, teachers, retirees, mothers, and young professionals, united by faith and friendship. They gathered in the basement fellowship hall, sharing scripture and stories, unaware that a stranger would soon step through their doors. Shortly after 8 p.m., Dylan Roof parked his black Hyundai outside the church. He sat for a few minutes, his gun loaded, a Glock .45 caliber pistol he had bought months earlier with money his father had given him for his birthday. The weapon was legal, the intent was not. With his small bag slung over his shoulder, he entered the building. The group greeted him warmly. He introduced himself simply as Dylan. No one turned him away. Instead, they offered him a Bible, a chair, and the same kindness they extended to anyone seeking God's word. For about an hour, Roof sat among them. Witnesses later recalled how quiet he was, occasionally flipping through pages, pretending to follow the discussion. They spoke about the Gospel of Mark, about forgiveness, about faith through struggle. These were conversations that defined the spirit of the Emmanuel Church: resilience through suffering, love over hatred. Yet as their voices filled the room with hope, Dylan Roof's thoughts were consumed by something entirely different. Every minute that passed brought him closer to the point of no return. Outside, Charleston's evening settled softly over the city, streetlights glowing, tourists walking the harbor, unaware of the tragedy about to unfold. Inside, the group bowed their heads in prayer. Reverend Pinckney closed his Bible. As the prayer ended, Roof quietly reached into his bag and pulled out his pistol. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, with chilling calmness, he raised the gun and fired. The first shots echoed through the hall. Panic erupted. People screamed and fell to the floor, diving under tables, clutching one another, praying for their lives. Roof fired again and again, methodically reloading. His victims called out to him, begging him to stop, reminding him that they had welcomed him, that they meant him no harm. But the hatred inside him drowned out their voices. In those few horrifying minutes, 9 people were shot dead. Reverend Clementa Pinckney, Cynthia Hurd, Tawanza Sanders, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Ethel Lance, Myra Thompson, Susie Jackson, DePayne Middleton Doctor, and Daniel Simmons. Each of them had come to study the Bible, not knowing they would become martyrs of faith and racial injustice. When the shooting stopped, 3 survivors remained. Roof looked at one of them and coldly said, "I have to do it. You rape our women and you're taking over our country. You have to go." Then he turned and walked out. He left behind bodies, blood, and the echoes of prayers interrupted by bullets. He got into his car, drove away into the quiet Charleston night, and disappeared. The entire attack had lasted barely 6 minutes. Yet within that short time, the peace of an entire community and the soul of a nation had been shattered. Back inside the church, police and emergency responders arrived to a devastating scene. Sirens filled the air. Family members gathered outside, holding one another, waiting for news that many already feared. Reporters began arriving, and within an hour, the story spread across television screens nationwide. The nation had seen mass shootings before, but this one was different. It wasn't just violence, it was hatred, deliberate and cold. A white man had walked into a black church and killed 9 people who had done nothing but pray with him. As dawn approached, Charleston awoke in grief. Outside Emmanuel AME Church, crowds gathered to sing hymns and light candles. Tears mixed with disbelief. Many asked how a place built on faith and forgiveness could be attacked so brutally. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies began one of the largest manhunts in South Carolina history. They had the suspect's image from surveillance cameras and witness accounts from the survivors. The man they were looking for, young, pale, with a bowl haircut and a vacant stare, had vanished overnight. But he wouldn't stay hidden for long. The hunt for Dylan Roof had begun, a chase that would stretch across state lines, capture the nation's attention, and eventually reveal the terrifying depths of one young man's hatred. What had started as an evening of worship in a sacred place had become the center of a national reckoning, a confrontation not only with one killer's evil, but with America's ongoing struggle against racism itself. The city of Charleston was about to face its darkest hours and its greatest test of forgiveness. By dawn on June 18, 2015, Charleston had changed forever. The morning light revealed not just a crime scene, but a wound that cut deep into the nation's conscience. Police cars still surrounded Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, their flashing lights reflecting off the brick walls of a building that had stood for nearly 2 centuries. Inside, investigators moved carefully through the fellowship hall, a place once filled with laughter and prayer now marked by shell casings, overturned chairs, and silence. The victims' names began to emerge, and with them, the faces of 9 lives lost to hate. The community, and soon the entire country, demanded answers. Who was this young man, and why had he done something so monstrous? Within hours, law enforcement released surveillance images showing a thin white man in black clothing entering the church. The car he drove, a black Hyundai Elantra, was quickly traced through license plate data. It didn't take long for police to identify him as Dylan Stormroof, a 21-year-old from Columbia, South Carolina. The manhunt stretched across state lines. Agents from the FBI and U.S. Marshals joined local authorities, while news channels across the country flashed his photo on every screen. The suspect was armed, dangerous, and on the run. Roof didn't go far. He spent the night driving aimlessly through South Carolina's backroads, occasionally stopping for gas, listening to the radio as his own face appeared in breaking news bulletins. He later told police that he thought about ending his life, but decided against it. Instead, he kept driving north. The next morning, more than 240 miles from Charleston, a sharp-eyed restaurant worker in Shelby, North Carolina, recognized the car from a television broadcast. The worker called 911, and within minutes, local police pulled the vehicle over. Dylan Roof surrendered quietly. He had a gun beside him and no plan left. His capture was met with relief, but also anger and disbelief. The mugshot released later that day showed him calm, even emotionless, his lips forming a faint smile. Many saw that image as the face of evil, a chilling contrast to the grief spreading across Charleston. Back in the city, mourning had already begun. Outside Emmanuel Church, hundreds gathered to pray, weep, and sing. Flowers and candles lined the church steps. Strangers held each other, united in shock and sorrow. President Barack Obama addressed the nation that afternoon, calling the shooting a reminder of the persistent dark vein of racism in America. He spoke softly but firmly. This was not just another act of violence. It was an attack on a sacred place, born from centuries of hate. As the days passed, the nation learned more about the victims, each one representing a story of faith and community. Reverend Clementa Pinckney, the pastor and state senator, had devoted his life to serving others. Cynthia Hurd, a 54-year-old librarian, had worked in the Charleston County Library System for over 30 years. Sharonda Coleman Singleton, a mother and high school coach, was known for her optimism and kindness. Tawanza Sanders, only 26, had recently graduated college and dreamed of starting his own business. Ethel Land, 70, had cared for the church for decades, ensuring it was always spotless for worship. Myra Thompson, 59, led Bible studies with passion and insight. Susie Jackson, 87, was the oldest victim, remembered for her devotion and warmth. DePayne Middleton Doctor, 49, sang in the choir and was raising 4 daughters. Daniel Simmons, 74, had been a pastor for many years, still serving despite his age. These names and their stories became symbols of strength, faith, and loss. While Charleston mourned, investigators began piecing together the shooter's life. What they found revealed a young man radicalized by hate and misinformation. Roof's online history was filled with visits to white supremacist websites, racist manifestos, and propaganda celebrating apartheid-era South Africa. He had even created his own website, where he posted photos of himself posing with Confederate flags and guns, along with a hateful essay declaring that he felt compelled to act. He wrote that he chose Charleston because of its history and because Emmanuel Church was one of the most famous black churches in America. In his twisted view, the church symbolized everything he wanted to destroy. As these details emerged, so did a national reckoning. The Confederate flag, long seen by many as a symbol of Southern heritage, but by others as a banner of racism, became the center of heated debate. In photos of Roof, the flag was everywhere, stitched on his jacket, waving behind him. Protesters across the country called for the removal of the Confederate flag from public buildings, especially in South Carolina, where it still flew on State House grounds. The argument was no longer about history, it was about hate and how symbols of the past continued to fuel violence in the present. Meanwhile, Charleston continued to heal in its own way. On June 19th, just 2 days after the shooting, the families of the victims attended Roof's first court appearance. What happened there stunned the nation. One by one, the grieving relatives addressed the young man who had taken everything from them. They didn't curse him or wish him pain. Instead, they offered something extraordinary: forgiveness. "I forgive you," said Nadine Collier, daughter of Ethel Lance. "You took something very precious from me, but I forgive you, and may God have mercy on your soul." Their words moved the courtroom to tears and became a defining moment in the aftermath of the tragedy. It was a gesture of unimaginable grace, faith triumphing over hate. Across Charleston, unity began to replace fear. Vigils continued every night, drawing thousands from all races and backgrounds. The sound of gospel music filled the air as people held hands, forming human chains that stretched for blocks. The message was clear: the city would not let hatred define it. But as the healing began, the legal process was only starting. Roof was charged with 9 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder under South Carolina law. Soon after, the federal government filed additional charges, including hate crimes and obstruction of religion, one of the most serious sets of charges ever brought in a case of domestic terrorism motivated by race. The Justice Department stated that Roof's actions were fueled by animosity toward African Americans, making it a direct attack on civil rights and religious freedom. In the months that followed, the community's resilience became a model for the nation. Emmanuel Church reopened its doors to worshipers, its pews once again filled with song and prayer. Murals and memorials were created throughout Charleston, honoring the Emmanuel Nine. People traveled from across the country to pay their respects. Yet the sense of unease remained. How could such a tragedy happen in a house of worship in the 21st century in America? For investigators, the focus was on ensuring that justice would be swift and thorough. Roof was examined by psychiatrists and found competent to stand trial. Despite his youth, prosecutors made it clear that they would seek the death penalty, arguing that his crime met every standard for the harshest punishment allowed by law. The case was not just about one killer. It was about confronting the violent consequences of racism and the enduring scars it leaves behind. As the year came to an end, Charleston had begun to find its balance between mourning and strength. The sight of the Emmanuel Church standing tall, with its white walls glowing under the southern sun, became a symbol of faith's endurance. The nation had seen hate tear through its heart, but it also witnessed forgiveness rise from its ashes. Yet for Dylann Roof, the path ahead was one of isolation, interrogation, and an unrepentant defiance that would soon shock the world even more. His words, actions, and the trial that followed would reveal just how deeply hatred had consumed him, and how determined the victims' families were to see justice served. The next chapter of this story would take place not in a church or on the streets, but inside a courtroom, where the questions of guilt, sanity, and evil would finally meet their answers. When Dylann Roof was led into the interrogation room, the world finally saw the face behind one of America's darkest crimes. He was calm, detached, and almost expressionless, as if unaware of the magnitude of what he had done. Over the next several hours, he gave investigators a full confession. Speaking in a soft, steady voice, he described how he had planned the attack, bought the gun, and chosen Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church specifically because it was a historic black congregation. He admitted that his motive was racial hatred and that he wanted to start what he called a race war. There was no remorse in his tone, no emotion in his words. To the detectives listening, it was chilling, a young man describing mass murder as if it were an abstract idea. Roof explained that he had searched online for information about black-on-white crime and had come across extremist websites filled with racist propaganda. Those pages convinced him that white people were being threatened, and he felt he had to act. He chose Charleston because of its history, because of slavery, and because Emmanuel Church represented strength in the black community. Someone had to do it, he said, and I guess that someone was me. His lack of empathy was so complete that investigators later described it as the most emotionless confession they had ever recorded. As the news spread, the public reaction was one of horror and disbelief. People tried to understand how someone so young could harbor such violent hatred. Experts studied his background, his broken family life, his isolation, his fascination with guns, and his online radicalization. Yet none of these explanations could fully answer why he had chosen to destroy innocent lives. For the victims' families, the only thing that mattered now was justice. By mid-2015, Dylann Roof was charged with 33 federal counts, including hate crimes resulting in death, obstruction of religion, and the use of a firearm in a violent crime. The federal government decided to seek the death penalty, marking one of the first times in U.S. history that a hate crime prosecution would pursue capital punishment. At the same time, South Carolina filed its own murder charges, ensuring that no matter what happened in the federal case, Roof would face the full weight of the law. As his trial approached, Roof's behavior became even more disturbing. He refused to express any regret, even after seeing photographs of his victims and hearing recordings of the 911 calls made that night. Instead, he continued to claim that his actions were necessary. In one of his writings from jail, he said, "I still feel as strongly as I did then. I haven't shed a tear for the innocent people I killed." The words stunned the public and revealed the depth of his delusion. In the courtroom, the contrast between Roof and the victims' families could not have been sharper. The families carried themselves with dignity and forgiveness, while Roof remained cold and detached. Before the trial, he dismissed his attorneys and chose to represent himself. The judge repeatedly warned him that it was a serious mistake, but he insisted. During jury selection, he said nothing about remorse or responsibility, only that he wanted to prevent his lawyers from presenting evidence of mental illness. He did not want to be seen as insane. He wanted to be seen as deliberate. The trial began in December 2016 in a federal courthouse in Charleston. Over several weeks, jurors listened to heartbreaking testimony. Survivors recounted how the prayer circle had turned into chaos, how they had played dead to survive, and how they still heard the sound of gunfire in their sleep. Prosecutors showed photographs of the crime scene and read Roof's racist manifesto aloud. Each detail painted a clear picture. This was not an act of confusion or temporary rage. It was a calculated act of racial terror. When it was his turn to speak, Roof offered no defense. He called no witnesses, presented no evidence, and made no effort to challenge the prosecution's case. He simply told the jury, "I felt like I had to do it, and I still feel like I had to do it." His words stunned the courtroom into silence. On January 10, 2017, after only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all 33 counts. 2 weeks later, the same jury reconvened for the sentencing phase. Once again, Roof refused to let his lawyers speak for him. He stood before the court alone, wearing his gray prison uniform, and told the jurors, "I don't know what good it would do for me to ask you to give me life. I still feel the same way I've always felt." Those were among his last public words before the jury sentenced him to death, the first person in U.S. history to receive the federal death penalty for a hate crime. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed: grief, relief, and sorrow all at once. Many said justice had been done. Others felt no verdict could undo the pain of what had been lost. Yet for the families of the Emmanuel Nine, the trial's end brought a measure of closure. They had faced the man who destroyed their lives and had responded not with hate, but with grace. After the sentencing, President Obama and national leaders again spoke about the deeper meaning of Charleston. The shooting had forced the country to confront the persistence of racism and violence, but it had also shown the power of forgiveness. Within weeks of the attack, South Carolina lawmakers voted to remove the Confederate flag from the State House grounds, a decision directly influenced by the victims' courage and the unity that followed their deaths. The flag that Rufe had once used as a symbol of hate became a reminder of a nation's decision to change. In the years that followed, the Emmanuel AME Church became more than a place of worship. It became a living memorial. Visitors from across the world came to pay their respects, leaving flowers, letters, and prayers. The names of the Emmanuel Nine were engraved into history, not just as victims, but as symbols of faith stronger than hate. The church continued its mission, preaching forgiveness and unity even in the shadow of loss. As for Dylan Roof, he was transferred to federal death row at Terre Haute Prison in Indiana, where he remains to this day. He has filed several appeals, all of which have been rejected. In 2021, the U.S. Court of Appeals upheld his death sentence, stating that no cold-blooded killer deserves more due process than he received. Roof has shown no sign of remorse, continuing to write and speak in ways that mirror the same racist ideology that led to the massacre. Yet despite his unrepentance, the story of Charleston is remembered not for him, but for those he tried to silence. Reverend Pinckney's sermons continue to inspire. Sharonda Coleman Singleton's students still honor her memory, and the families who once stood in court to forgive the unforgivable remain living examples of strength. The Charleston church shooting was more than a tragedy. It was a test of faith, of humanity, and of a nation's ability to heal. It exposed the deadly consequences of hate, but also revealed the enduring power of love and forgiveness. When the world looked at Charleston, it did not see a city divided. It saw a community standing together, determined that violence would not have the last word. Even years later, the echo of that night remains. The quiet prayers interrupted by gunfire, the voices that rose in forgiveness, and the church that still stands tall against the tide of hate. It is a reminder that while evil may seek to destroy, faith endures. The story of the Emmanuel Nine is not one of death, but of defiance, a story of people who believed, even in their final moments, that love is stronger than fear, and that light, no matter how small, will always outshine the darkness.